Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Amy Berquist. I am a senior staff attorney at the Advocates for Human Rights. I'm also a vice president of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. And we're here today to do a debriefing of two universal periodic reviews that happened this week related to the Caribbean. So we'll be talking about the UPR, or Universal Periodic Review of St. Lucia, and of St. Kitts and Nevis. And we have two great experts with us today from Greater Caribbean for Life. Leela, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Greater Caribbean for Life too?
Okay, so my name is Leela Ramdeen. I'm the chair of the Greater Caribbean for Life, which is an independent, not-for-profit civil society organization that was established in October 2013 following a conference in Trinidad and Tobago, which was attended by abolitionists from 12 Greater Caribbean countries, as well as abolitionists from further afield. GCL, as we call it, was incorporated under the laws of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico in January 2014. It is the only organization in the Greater Caribbean region that's devoted to working towards the permanent abolition of the death penalty in our region and to support Caribbean abolitionist activists and organizations in this region. We strive to ensure that our region becomes part of the global trend to join the 143 countries, about 2/3 of the countries of our world, that have abolished the death penalty in law or practice. And while our members condemn the rise of violent crime in our region and express solidarity with victims, we reject the notion that capital punishment will act as a deterrent or foster respect for life in our communities. We are committed to promoting peace, respect for life, and good neighborliness as appropriate methods of reducing crime in our region. We believe that this strategy promotes a more durable and effective solution than taking lives. So our motto is, let's stop crime, not lives. And remember, there are 10 English-speaking countries in our region that are retentionist countries. And the death row, just remember, some of our death rows are empty. Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, there are others as well that are empty. And we're still holding on to the death penalty. It's time to abolish it.
Great. And it's really great that Greater Caribbean for Life is a member of the World Coalition, and the World Coalition helps to really support efforts in the Caribbean through other members as well. And we also want to provide support for the ability to leverage the United Nations mechanisms to put additional pressure on the governments in the region to take those final steps toward abolition of the death penalty. So we really appreciate your work in the region and with the coalition. I'll also say to those of you who are watching online on Facebook, you are welcome to submit questions or comments in the chat. And we have Louis Linel from the Secretariat of the World Coalition. If you're watching on the Coalition's Facebook feed, go ahead and post your questions, and we will feed them to us here as well, so we can share, you can be a part of the discussion. Angelina is our other expert. Angelina, do you want to introduce yourself now?
Very briefly, I'm also an executive member of Greater Caribbean for Life. I'm also an attorney at law. I originate from Trinidad and Tobago, but I've been practicing in St. Kitts and Nevis for the past 10 years.
Great, thank you. So before we dive in and talk about the UPRs that happened on Tuesday for St. Kitts and Nevis and on Wednesday for St. Lucia, I thought I would do a quick overview of what the Universal Periodic Review is in case anyone watching isn't familiar with what happens at the United Nations as part of this. So I'm going to share my screen to show a little graphic that helps to explain the process. And apologies to those of you who have seen this already. I know it can probably get a little tedious, but we want to make sure everyone is on the same page for purposes of our discussion. So you should see on the screen a circular diagram that has to do with the general procedure the Universal Periodic Review goes through. This is a mechanism of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. And as the name suggests, it's universal. Every country in the world goes through the process, and it's periodic. It happens roughly every 5 years. And it's a review of the country's human rights record. So all issues are fair game, whether it's civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, or other issues. And where we are in the process, or where we are this week, is step 2 in the process. So if we back up to step 1, that was preparing information for the review. These are reports that were submitted last year, around the middle of last year. There were joint stakeholder reports, so a report submitted by the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty and the Advocates for Human Rights. And then other entities also submit information. Then the interactive dialogue happens, and every country gets a 3.5-hour session on the floor of the Human Rights Council, dedicated to human rights issues in that country. And any other country in the world can raise its hand and say, we would like to make a statement during that review. So they, based on the number of countries that sign up to make those statements, they divvy up the time. So for St. Lucia, there were a total of 58 countries that spoke, and each country had 1 minute 50 seconds. For St. Kitts and Nevis, there were 60 countries that spoke, so just a couple more. And again, the same time limit, 1 minute 50 seconds per speaker. But you'll notice a lot of the statements were actually much shorter, and that's because if there are a lot of countries that sign up, then countries may have just 55 seconds to speak, and so they generally tend to prepare pretty brief statements, interventions for the review. But any country can make an intervention, and usually what they do during that intervention, among other things, is make recommendations. And if they incant those magic words, we recommend, or here offer the following recommendations, then that triggers a duty to respond on the part of the state that's being reviewed. So that state that's being reviewed has to say yes or no to each one of those recommendations. So the recommendations were made this week, and then St. Lucia, St. Kitts and Nevis, those authorities will have until the June session of the Human Rights Council to decide the fate of those recommendations. Will they be accepted, or will they be noted or rejected, as it's called in UN speak? Then, so that happens at the adoption of the report. That's step 3. And then, of course, the big part is implementation of any accepted recommendations. That's really 4 years of the 5-year cycle is implementation. When a government has made those commitments, they then need to put their nose to the grindstone and ensure that the recommendations are implemented. And at each stage of the process, there are roles for non-governmental organizations like the Coalition Against the Death Penalty and Greater Caribbean for Life to be a part of it, whether it's submitting information or lobbying members of the Human Rights Council. We sent out over 100 emails urging members of the Human Rights Council to make recommendations on the death penalty. We also hosted a side event last week that Leela and Angelina participated in, also to provide more information to Human Rights Council delegates. And then now is the time to put pressure on the government recommendations that we liked from the interactive dialogue, and to ensure that when June comes around, the recommendations will be accepted. So that's a rough overview of the review cycle, and we will now talk a little bit about the reviews. So the St. Lucia is the one we'll start with, and Leela is going to be our resident expert on St. Lucia. As I said, there were 58 states that presented interventions during the review, and of those 58, 20 made recommendations on death penalty issues. So that's really quite a lot. More than a third of the countries that spoke raised the death penalty as an issue of all the different things that they could talk about. And it's a notable increase from St. Lucia's last review in 2015, because in St. Lucia's last review, only 13 countries raised those issues. So we'd like to think that our lobbying efforts made a difference, raised the attention of death penalty issues for this interactive dialogue that happened on Wednesday. I thought it would be helpful to hear a little bit about the government's own position with respect to the death penalty. And we did get a little bit of a sense of that during the review. The government has a chance to present its report and then respond to questions and recommendations. So I thought we would start with that to get a sense of what the government sort of seem to think about the death penalty. And what really struck me, I don't know if Leila, this struck you as well, but there was a lot of talk on the part of this Mr. Cosmos Richardson, who's the permanent representative of St. Lucia to the United Nations headquarters in New York. He was representing the government. There's a lot of talk about, well, we can't ratify these treaties because we don't have the capacity to implement them. And so we're not going to do this because it takes so much effort for us to do the reporting and implementation. But of course, abolishing the death penalty doesn't really take a lot of capacity. It's just changing the law, and that should be relatively easy. There's no additional reporting duties. In fact, it would make it a lot easier for them to go through these universal periodic reviews, because it would be one less issue to talk about if they abolish the death penalty. So it seems as though this normal excuse, well, we can't ratify this treaty, we can't do this because we're a small island nation with limited resources, limited capacity. Actually, the argument is the reverse with respect to the death penalty. Like, change the law. Yes, you'd have to change the Constitution as well. But that's, relatively cheap to do. It doesn't require additional resources. So it's really, I think, partly a matter of political will. What are your impressions, Leila, about sort of the political status of the death penalty and the government's position in St. Lucia?
I just want to say that St. Lucia is part of the 10 English-speaking countries in our region that are retentionist countries. And it seems as though from information I have that all the Attorney General in the region are committed to just maintain the status quo, and that's a real issue. Because changing the Constitution, as we know, requires a 3/5 majority, and quite often because of our political system, it's not only the political will of the government in power, but also the opposition. And you need the opposition to get that 3/5 majority. So there are those issues. So changing the Constitution is step one, but again, you must have the political will. And quite often, the people on the ground are not willing to look at change, effecting change, because of the rise in crime, and because for many of them, the only way forward is to, as they say, pop next. And so you have to change that culture by doing what Mexico said. I was interested in Mexico's response, that as well as advancing efforts to abolish the death penalty, it must include awareness-raising campaigns on human rights and alternatives to the death penalty. And so remember, St. Lucia doesn't have, they're thinking, the government has said we have to think of the population and their views on the death penalty. So let's have a referendum in our countries. But before the referendum, as I said recently, you have to raise awareness of human rights. You can't just go cold and have a referendum. So Mr. Richardson's statement representing his country about not having the capacity, in my view, all our countries have the capacity. We need political will, and we need to look at how we get all political parties on board to see that in the 21st century, there is no place in our world for the death penalty. So I would not agree with his position that we don't have the capacity. That's sort of, in my view, fudging it a little bit. Yeah. I noticed, sorry, so shall I continue?
Sure.
All right. So I noticed of the 58 countries, the 20 that made recommendations, I noticed about 8 or so had these recommendations as their number one priority. They each, with the 1 minute, 60 seconds, they have, some of them made 3 or 4, or 1 or 2, 5 recommendations. And to get it as the top, as the priority for some of the countries, to me was important. Shall I list the names of those countries that, well, I have about 17 here: Chile, Costa Rica, Fiji, Finland, France, Germany, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Mexico, Paraguay, Portugal, Spain, Togo, Ukraine, Uruguay, Australia, and I think there's 3 more I must have missed out. These are the countries that actually prioritized in their recommendations. They listed and they listed the abolition or moratorium. And it's interesting to look at the language that they use. So for some, remember, abolish the death penalty. The word abolish comes first, like in Costa Rica, And if not, as they say, begin with declaring a moratorium with a view to abolition. So I think they were well thought out, the recommendations. Fiji talk about considering imposing a moratorium and take positive steps to abolish. So there are two processes, because as we know, in the English-speaking Caribbean, comprise 25% of the votes on the moratorium at the UN General Assembly. And because they all voted recently again, against the moratorium, that's step one. Think about, establishing the moratorium and then work towards abolition. Finland noted that there was a de facto moratorium in St. Lucia. When you have a de facto moratorium, so they say then abolish the death penalty and ratify many of them. This is important. You need to ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, which talks about aiming at abolishing the death penalty. And of course, you then have other countries that talk about is with a view to not only abolishing the death penalty, but the second optional protocol and the first and the covenant itself. There was Luxembourg that talked about adapting the constitution to abolish the death, because so the different stages. And what comes out in all these is that they're aware of what you need to do. You need to have the moratorium, adapt the constitution, abolish the death penalty, and as Luxembourg said, and replace it with a sentence that is fair, proportionate, and in accordance with international human rights standards. And that is so it's not only just to abolish it. We're not saying let the criminals go free,
right,
but and so it's important to note the countries that are actually giving sound advice, in my view. And then of course, Paraguay made mention of an important issue to declare formally a moratorium or abolition of the death penalty in line with Sustainable Development Goal 16. As we know, SDG 16 aims to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, to provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. So linking it to the SDG, to me, is really important, since they all signed up to the Sustainable Development Goal. And of course, the other issue was abolish. Yes, Australia did the same. So these 20 countries, when you read their recommendations, there are different aspects of it that come out, but really important that that they all focus at the end of the day on the abolition, either moratorium leading to that. I noted though that there are 4 countries that spoke during both sessions, for St. Kitts and Nevis and for St. Lucia, but they only made recommendations on the death penalty in their presentations for St. Kitts and Nevis, and those are Panama, Slovenia, Canada, and Honduras. And there were 3 countries that made recommendations to abolish the death penalty for St. Kitts and Nevis, but they didn't speak during the session for St. Lucia. And those are Rwanda, Switzerland, and Latvia. So, it's important if we add up, are those who spoke at St. Kitts and Nevis recommending, are we going to add those 2 to St. Lucia because it's in the same region? But it's interesting to know that there were those differences. And again, it could be a time factor to speak.
Yeah, and I was impressed at how many countries in many different parts of the world expressed interest in both countries. It wasn't just countries in the region. It wasn't just Latin American countries. It was all over the place. African countries, Asian countries, European countries. It's really a lot of interest. Well, let's take a look at what His Excellency Mr. Cosmos Richardson had to say about the death penalty, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Give me a moment for me to share my screen and make this happen. Let's see. I think if I do that, it should work. And I need to share my sound as well. Share sound. Okay. And I need to find the exact point where he speaks. So give me just a moment here. I wrote it down as 101.50. Okay, this is about where he begins talking.
Seminars hosted by the group of friends of the Convention Against Torture Initiative. These seminars were conducted to ensure that relevant public officials acquired sufficient knowledge with the aim of ratification, implementation, and reporting on the UNCAP. The government of St. Lucia and ratification of UNCAP. But we intend towards fulfilling this commitment. Regarding the abolition of the death penalty, I wish to note that St. Lucia has maintained a de facto moratorium on the use of the death penalty since 1995. So it's 25 or 26 years since the last sentence of the death penalty was carried out in St. Lucia. The government of St. Lucia has, however, implemented rehabilitative and restorative justice practices with the introduction of the parole and probation systems, as detailed in Chapter 3.01 of the St. Lucia's Criminal Code. Most recently, in December of 2020, just last month, St. Lucia held its first parole hearing, which led to the parole of 2 prisoners who had served over 20 years for the crime of murder. Article 6.2 of the ICCPR notes that, and I quote, "In countries which have not abolished the death penalty, sentence of death may be imposed only for the most serious crimes in accordance with the law in force at the time of the commission of the crime, and not contrary to the provisions of the present covenant and to the covenant on the prevention and punishment of crime of genocide." That said, we recognize the right of countries to establish legal systems, including the determination of appropriate legal penalties in accordance with our international law obligations. And we will continue to honor our international law obligations.
So that was sort of the official party line on the death penalty. Was that disappointing for you to hear, Leela?
Yes, because although I listened when he talked about two prisoners who had served over 20 years, that they were. Did you get a feeling that they actually succeeded in the parole hearing? Did he? Oh,
I think he said they were released.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Because that's important. Because quite often in our region, we have problems getting the Mercy Committee to sit. And so that's something positive. Over 20 years, life should not mean the whole of your life. So that's something positive. So although we have the death penalty and although it says life, I know some countries like St. Lucia and even Trinidad are finding creative ways to to get the Mercy Committee to look again. But of course, it requires opportunities for both the victim and the perpetrator to make recommend presentation to the Mercy Committee. And remember, we had in the case of Aaron Trimingham after Pratt and Morgan in 1993, Aaron Trimingham, that case for the Privy Council made it clear that if a country is going to consider imposing the death penalty, then it has to be for the worst of the worst. And so far, as Angelina will tell you, so far the last one case I think is now in St. Kitts and Nevis. The worst of the worst, we haven't really got there yet, and so it's heartening to know that a place like St. Lucia is looking at the death row is empty. So why not find creative ways of either releasing and rehabilitating? So that's important that he talked about rehabilitation. Very important.
Yeah. Well, I thought it would also be good. You mentioned among the recommendations you mentioned, Leela, was Mexico's recommendation about awareness raising. I thought it'd be great to play that one as well for people who are watching so they can see what that was all about. So I'll cue that up in just a moment here. Okay. All right, Mexico.
Thank you, Chairman. We'd like to express our thanks to the delegation of St. Lucia for the presentation of its report. We acknowledge the discontinuation of corporal punishment in schools, and we would urge the government to streamline their own normative framework with a view to its elimination. Further, we hail the ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. With a view to strengthening efforts in terms of human rights, we recommend the following. 1. To establish a national human rights institution for human rights in keeping with the Paris Principles. 2. To make headway in efforts to abolish the death penalty, including awareness-raising campaigns on human rights and alternatives to the death penalty. 3. To decriminalize consensual sex between individuals of the same sex and to adopt measures necessary to eradicate all form of discrimination or violence against LGBTI persons. 4. Set the minimum age of consent for marriage at 18 with a view to eradicating child marriage. 5. Guarantee all individuals access to education and sexual and reproductive health care services and adopt a national strategy to avoid teenage pregnancy. We wish St. Lucia the best of success in this review. Thank you.
So awareness raising and take positive steps toward abolition. So, and you know, we've seen this with other members of the World Coalition where we've done advocacy and called on this because a lot of times governments say, well, the public supports the death penalty, so what can we do? And so it's really good strategically to have these recommendations that say, raise awareness. If you're going to rely on the public and the public's opinion, that opinion ought to be informed. And the government has that obligation to share information about the death penalty, about what the human rights implications are. Although I'd be really, concerned if Mr. Cosmos Richardson were the one to do the awareness raising, because all he says is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 6, Paragraph 2, they allow it for the most serious crimes. There's a lot more to the human rights issues, of course, related to the death penalty.
Yes. And that, that case in 2018 that the Caribbean Court of Justice found that we shouldn't hold on to saving clauses which were incorporated in our constitutions when we became independent. And the CCJ, which they thought would be a hanging court once some countries moved from the Privy Council, made it clear that that you cannot hold on to these colonial forms when England itself, Britain, has got rid of the death penalty. So we need to look at how we move forward. Is it appropriate in the 21st century for us to have, when the CCJ condemned the saving clause that maintained hanging, that should really be a red flag to all our English-speaking Caribbean countries. Time to move on. Time to develop an alternative way of dealing with crime and violence in our countries.
And just think about how wonderful it would be if one country took the first step and could really be a leader in the region to encourage the fellow countries in the region to take that additional step. I think, St. Lucia is well positioned to do that. And,
and then when we think of the awareness raising strategies that are available by the Death Penalty Project, the World Coalition, GCL, our speaking tours, we have had, Professor Roger Hood, who died recently, and Florence Simonga, doing amazing work in our region, raising awareness of the right kind of questions to ask if you're going to have a referendum on the death penalty, and how, in fact, your results, the outcome can be so different depending on the nature of the questions.
Yeah. So Leela, with these 20 recommendations, or more than 20 recommendations, but 20 states that made interventions, are you optimistic that the government of St. Lucia will accept any of them, or do you think it will be just flat out rejecting all of them? What do you think will happen in June?
I'm hoping that in June they will at least look at raising awareness, a campaign to raise awareness, and GCL is going to have perhaps a virtual speaking tour in St. Lucia this year because we can't go there physically. And we're going to focus on that issue, on raising awareness, but also to think about a moratorium, to think about breaking that
an official moratorium. Yeah, because they have a de facto one.
The de facto one is just the official one. They need to actually say, look, you know, step one, let's do this. And then look at the Constitution.
Yeah. Well, hopefully the folks in St. Lucia can put some pressure on their government to accept at least a couple of those recommendations, including Mexico's and the ones to have a formal moratorium. That would be a really good first step, and would also open the door for collaboration between GCL and the government to do that awareness raising. Like, you're already doing it. That would seem like an easy next step. Well, let's shift gears and talk about St. Kitts and Nevis. And Angelina, you know, this is your area of expertise, so we're really excited to hear from you. And for St. Kitts and Nevis, there were 60 countries that spoke, that offered interventions, and 23 of them, so well over a third, made recommendations on the death penalty. That's up from 17 last time around. So you have an increase of 6, which is really great to see that level of attention to these issues. Angelina, did you have a chance to either watch the review or look over the recommendations? Did you have any initial impressions from the review?
Thank you, Amy. I did. In fact, I took it upon myself to share the link with the major media houses in St. Kitts who were not aware that we were actually given a report on 19. And you're right, 38 countries made recommendations, what I would consider strong recommendations, either to abolish. I love the fact that the word abolished, the death penalty, was used a lot, which gives them the option of doing it either through local avenues or by ratifying the second optional protocol. And of course, there were some that were a little bit more diplomatic about considering, but the fact that I think I noted at least maybe of the 23, more than 50% use the words recommend that you abolish it. And so I think when the next cycle comes up, it will be difficult for St. Kitts not to frontally address in their report the recommendation that has been made towards the abolition of the death penalty. So I'm very happy about that. Just to add on, most of the same countries that did St. Kitts also did, St. Lucia also did St. Kitts. Of course, the Caribbean countries like Trinidad and Jamaica, which were involved, stayed very, very far away from anything to do with the death penalty for obvious reasons, because they have, I guess, some sort of pact, maybe, in that way.
Well, and countries don't want to seem hypocritical. If they themselves retain the death penalty, they're not going to make recommendations that other countries abolish it.
Of course. I think St. Kitts is actually in a very, very good position to at least address local legislation to abolish the death penalty, because we require 2/3 of the majority in Parliament to amend our Constitution, which makes an exception to the right to life, death by hanging if you're convicted of murder or treason. Because our current government, actually we have 11 seats and the current government holds 9. So they are well positioned without having to get the opposition on board to amend the Constitution. Amendment to the Constitution was a very big topic leading up to the elections, which were held late last year. So I think that it doesn't really have that excuse to use anymore. When we participated in the publication by Sir Roger Ford and the Death Penalty Project called Sentenced to Death Without Execution, Why Capital Punishment Has Not Yet Been Abolished in the Eastern Caribbean and Barbados, a number of the politicians who now sit in government were interviewed. And we dare say that the majority, well, just over 50% were in agreement once the question was asked in a more specific way. They did not support the death penalty. So I think that we are well on our way. GCL, through myself, we had some radio talk shows last year leading up to Human Rights Day and World Day recognizing the abolition of the death penalty. And the public seems to be changing towards that, but of course it has to be done in a holistic view. So I'm thinking that I'm hopeful. Also, the fact that St. Kitts and Nevis recently signed on to the Convention Against Torture, it has given me some level of encouragement that we are heading in the right direction.
Great. And I thought it was interesting, the government position during the UPR was a little bit different from the government's position in St. Lucia. St. Lucia's position was more of a hard line, like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights allows it. It's only for the most serious crimes. But the government was represented in this case by Her Excellency Mrs. Kaye Bass, who's the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Aviation. And she offered a little bit of a different perspective, and again, drawing on public opinion, which, you know, we hear that a lot. So I thought I would play that clip just to hear how she's presenting the issue after receiving a lot of recommendations to abolish the death penalty, institute a formal moratorium, to see how she framed it in her presentation at the Human Rights Council. So give me a moment and I'll cue that up and we can have a listen.
Mr. Vice Chancellor, distinguished delegates, with a view to ratification in the near future. According to Section 4.1 of the St. Kitts and Nevis Constitution, a person shall not be deprived of his life intentionally, save in execution of the sentence of a court in respect of the criminal offense of treason or murder under any law of which he has been convicted. Notwithstanding, it must be emphasized that St. Kitts and Nevis has not imposed the death penalty for several years, and that it is in fact very rare, with only 3 persons having been executed within the last 35 years, none in over 12 years. St. Kitts and Nevis asserts, however, that the question of whether to retain or abolish the death penalty should be determined by each state, taking fully into account the sentiments of its own people, the state of crime and criminal policy. We maintain that, as expressed in the ICCPR, the sentence of death may only be imposed for the most serious crimes and can only be carried out pursuant to a final judgment rendered by a competent court. This is the extent of its application in St. Kitts and Nevis. The reality is that the death penalty remains a legal element of our penal code, and the government will continue to ensure that its domestic legislation does not contravene its human rights obligations.
So there you have it, based on the sentiments of its own people and the level of crime in the country. So Angelina, is the public well informed in St. Kitts and Nevis about the death penalty and the human rights issues around it?
No, absolutely not. And I should say one of the recommendations which was made by countries such as India is the establishment of a national human rights along the lines of the Paris agreement,
a national human rights institution, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that is important because we don't have any sort of human rights organization right now. We have some women rights group. We don't have a human rights organization. And when I started the conversation last year, I was a bit afraid because, you know, St. Kitts and Nevis for some time has been the murder capital of the world based on how small our population is and number of murders. So people were very emotional about it. But, you know, we began this conversation and there were a lot of people who were calling in and, you know, indicating based on the information that they're now being told through my work with GCL, they're changing their view on the death penalty. Even the last individual who was executed in our region was from St. Kitts, Mr. Charles Laplace, and that happened in December 2008. And I did a little test case study where I spoke to two young ladies and I said to them, well, what did you think about it? And they were all in agreement with him being executed because of it was the worst of the worst. And then when I raised with them in the reports where he explained what happened, and even though we never excuse murder, once they heard the different factors that came out in those psychological reports, their minds changed and thought he should not have been executed, but perhaps sentenced to jail for life. So once we began to pose different questions to the public, they began to say, okay, I never really thought about it that way. And, maybe things could be different. So I think there definitely has to be before, in another part, I think Kay spoke about the government will engage with civil society in St. Kitts. Civil society in St. Kitts really refers to the Christian Council, Chamber of Commerce, and if they see necessary, a group called Business and Professional Women St. Kitts Club. So it's not a very large group of people, but as you can see, there's no true human rights organization involved because, myself and probably one other lawyer, the two lone voices, or at least vocal voices publicly. So I would hope that if the government does decide to go that route, that GCL would be invited to participate. At least we certainly would impose ourselves, and or they would at least try to establish a national council for human rights so that there could truly be meaningful discussion. I feel, having visited high schools, that the younger generation definitely does not hold to that eye for an eye, tooth for tooth type of position that really, is the basis for the death penalty. So I think if it's done properly, I think the government may be surprised that the people's true view is not where they think it is.
Mm-hmm. And of course, people are open-minded. They're open to hearing information. With the example that you gave, Angelina, given a little bit more information, they may realize that things aren't as clear-cut as they may seem. It's not a matter of black and white, yes and no, that there are nuances, and no person is as bad as the worst thing they've done in their life. And we need to realize that every person is capable of loving and being loved and being worthy of fundamental dignity, even if they have done something horrible. I thought I wanted to play the recommendation from Uruguay because they had a really interesting recommendation in my view that responds quite nicely to Mrs. Callebas's point about the sentiments of the people of St. Kitts and Nevis. So let me tee that up and we'll have a listen.
Gracias. Thank you. Uruguay welcomes the delegation from St. Kitts and Nevis and thanks it for presenting its national report. We acknowledge efforts made to improve the human rights situation in the country since the second UPR cycle, and we are pleased in particular at the establishment of a national reporting and follow-up mechanism. Similarly, and in a constructive spirit, Uruguay would like to make the following recommendations. 1. Bolster its commitment to the principles of equality and non-discrimination both in legislation as well as in practice by adopting the decriminalization of same-sex consensual relations. 2. Request technical support from the Office of the High Commissioner to move forward in ratifying the key international human rights instruments to which the country is not yet a party, and ensure in its national legal system that the full obligations stemming from treaties already in force for St. Kitts and Nevis are included. 3. Just as in the previous cycle, we recommend that a legal moratorium to the death penalty be established with a view to its definitive abolition and ensure access to relevant information on the topic so as to promote a transparent and informed debate at the national level. Lastly, we encourage St. Kitts and Nevis to accept and implement the recommendations received, and for that objective, we call upon the international community to provide its cooperation and technical assistance. Thank you very much.
So what were your thoughts, Angelina, when you heard that recommendation from Uruguay?
Well, I'm very happy that it was put in that very diplomatic way, and very important about the information and tools required, because there isn't really much available. And one of the things which Kay Bass, Permanent Secretary Kay Bass, was very proud of is that we have a really good prison reform facility. But that's not something that is usually mentioned locally, because of course, if someone can be rehabilitated, then it goes against one of the arguments for the death penalty. And in fact, Brandon Lee, who was the last person who the DPP made an application for the death penalty to be handed down on him, a young man, 21 years old. September last year, he got sentenced for life. And while in prison, he was sentenced for murdering his sister. He was convicted for murdering his sister, younger sister. While in prison, he began doing our regional CXC examinations, and he placed top in the Caribbean in mathematics on one other subject. So it just shows you that with the right type of environment and these persons who may carry out the worst action you could think of, murder, they can be reformed. And, you know, again, part of our conversation included things like that, because the public was very outraged about the way in which this murder happened. And, you know, they kind of not necessarily changed, but they weren't as steadfast about seeing him as a monster, because you never really know what drives someone to do what they did at the point in time. So I do think that we definitely need to have a lot of information fed into St. Kitts and Nevis, a lot of public awareness program. Of course, that calls for resources and facilities and that sort of thing. And that's where the international groups can come in to assist. But again, St. Kitts, I think all the arguments that St. Kitts initially had for keeping the death penalty, it doesn't make sense anymore, because boasting on the one hand, well, in 35 years, we only had 3, and in the last 12, we haven't had none. You're right, we basically have a de facto moratorium. So why not at least try, maybe even if it's for 2 or 3 years, to have a legal moratorium? That way you will see how the public responds. And because you can then extend it, or, you know, just to see where things are. That's another approach that they can have. And just to add that when Mr. Laplace was executed by hanging, the same competent court existed, but he never got the full opportunity to exhaust his rights before the competent court. He never got the opportunity to appeal to the Privy Council. His appeal was filed out of time because of incompetent and inexperienced lawyers, again, because he could not afford, you know, competent counsel at the time. So there's so many things that, you know, just making that statement, I think while it is a subtle way of saying we're not going to do it, that's a decision for us to make and not for you to tell us what to do. I think part of being in the UN and being part of a UPR is to appreciate and accept that your peers can review and make recommendations on that matter. So I'm hopeful for St. Kitts. I think maybe the next time around, I think something may happen. I'm hopeful. I don't know, Leela, but I guess we have to hold on to the hope.
Yes, yes. Hope continue to beat in our breasts eternally. Yes.
Yes. Well, and Angelina, you had mentioned that there had been some discussion over the course of the election about constitutional reforms. Do you think this could be worked into a package to take it out of the Constitution, at least, so it would be easier to institute some change?
Well, I'm sure if the government really does set up a committee to have constitutional review to see what part of the Constitution can be modified or reformed, I certainly think that GCL will be insisting that this be up for consideration, and if it not, at least going to the public through the media, in our speaking tours, raising awareness to the point where the government cannot ignore it anymore.
And given the fact that you said that the majority of those in Parliament belong to the ruling party, unlike in Trinidad where it's very close, then, you know, they don't have to wait for 2/3 of majority. They can pass it themselves. But we do need what Uruguay said. We need transparent and informed debate. and it has to be transparent, not fooling people quite often, because quite a lot of citizens, particularly in Trinidad and Tobago, believe what they hear, that it is a deterrent. So when you have people in positions of authority saying that the death penalty is a deterrent and not given, that's not transparent, it's not informed, doesn't draw on the information that we have. So let's hope that there will be that informed debate, so we can push for that. Hopefully when GCL has its speaking tour, virtual speaking tour, we'll be able to address schools, students, lawyers, and others, and help raise awareness.
Yeah. And in fact, after Charles Laplace was executed in December 2009, the murder rate increased in 2000. I think the week after was a bloody week in St. Kitts. So that just, I mean, if the public knew that, then they would recognize it's really not a deterrent as they think. No, it's spiked every year since then. So what's the point of, just state-sanctioned killing so that you can say that we have this tool?
Yeah, and it's an issue, in so many countries where the death penalty exists, that the government asserts that it's a deterrent to crime. It's not something unique to the Caribbean, where governments think and they just throw that out. And interestingly, at the Human Rights Council in March, there's going to be a high-level panel discussion on the issue of deterrence and the death penalty. So the World Coalition and the Advocates for Human Rights are preparing a written statement with all of the evidence. We're going to throw lots and lots of evidence at them to show that this is a myth. That in fact it doesn't have a deterrent effect, and people think, I think Leela, you started out saying this, like, we're not saying somebody who commits a crime shouldn't be punished. Of course somebody should be punished. So if you're looking at the deterrent effect, you need to compare apples to apples. You need to compare punishing somebody who's committed murder, punishing them with life in prison, for example, versus punishing them with the death penalty. And when you make that comparison, there isn't an enhanced deterrent effect with the death penalty.
Yes, I mean, in Trinidad, they hanged 9 people in 3 days, and they keep, the Dolce di Gang. And immediately after, as Angelina said, there was a spike in murders. So it was not a deterrent. So we have to just face reality and look at alternatives. You notice a lot of the recommendations talked about finding alternatives that would be more suitable, really, in the 21st century.
And you also have to take into account the type of event which led to the untimely taking of life. Because if it comes out, for example, of a domestic violence situation, which happened in Charles Laplace, which happened in Fox and the Queen, which happened in Brandon Lee, these aren't persons who are sitting down on the street saying, hey, let's go murder someone. It arises out of some emotional event that just became fatal. So in that moment, no one's thinking, well, whoa, I might be executed by hanging, let me stop. No one's thinking that. So it's not that we have premeditated murder or murder for hire in these parts, really, that you can think that they would be sitting down weighing the pros and cons of doing this particular action. More often than not, it's an impulsive thing that happens. And so, again, the deterrent argument is simply just not there, not anymore, if it ever was a valid reason for taking life.
Because research has shown that the majority of people don't sit and think, as you say, I'm going to kill you. It's crime of passion, it's on the spur of the moment. So it's not a deterrent, because they don't think. I think South Africa, when it abolished the death penalty, the statement by that judge, he talked about that in his statement, that people don't sit and think of the consequences when it's like a crime of passion, and majority of murders are done in those circumstances. So you can't say it's a deterrent.
And it rests on the assumption that somebody, if they were going to contemplate, oh, should I murder this person? What are the consequences? That they would say, oh, life in prison. That sounds okay. I'll go ahead and murder for that. Because you're having your liberty deprived for the rest of your entire life, that's a horrible sanction. Like I mean, if they are rational thinkers, that should be just as much of a deterrent as the death penalty.
Oh, yes. In fact, now with COVID-19, where persons have to be quarantined and can't leave their house, some people, I've heard many persons say, in fact, our former commissioner of police, he had to go into quarantine for 14 days. He could not leave a hotel room. And after the 4th day, he was like, I can't do anymore. So I think people now kind of begin to recognize that life imprisonment or term imprisonment is not, it's not a bed of roses. It's a terrible thing. And so once people really hear about those type of stories, then I think that would be more of a deterrent to join like gangs.
Yes.
Like if you have former gang members who are in jail speaking to young, to the youth about, you know, staying away from gangs because of how terrible it is in jail, then that may prevent them from getting into gangs and eventually from going into gang violence and that sort of thing. I think focusing on things like conflict resolutions, both in a domestic situation and at schools, if the government places focus on things like that, then, you know, we'd be in a better position than just keeping an archaic law that nobody's even using.
Mm-hmm.
Or could use, because the law is so difficult. It's so difficult now to execute someone. And based on the number of cases, you know, the time period, you're going to cross 5 years, which is then going to make it inhumane. You have to provide them with competent counsel all the way up to the Privy Council and the Mercy Committee. So you end up spending so much money, and at the end of it, after 5 years, you still can't execute them because it's now cruel and inhumane. So even from that perspective, it doesn't make sense from a rational and economic point of view to keep the death penalty.
It's political will. At the end of the day, we need the political will.
Yeah. Well, we're just about out of time. I wanted to check with Louis in Paris to see whether we have any questions or comments coming in through the Facebook comments.
No, not yet.
Okay, well, if you're watching now or watching on the rebroadcast, feel free to pose questions there, and we'll check in, and we can always type a written comment to you there. But I'm as I share the optimism that Leila and Angelina have for the outcomes of these universal periodic reviews for St. Kitts and Nevis and St. Lucia. I hope that at least some of the recommendations will be accepted, and then it will be 4 years of implementation, and GCL is really well situated to help that happen so that when we're back 5 years from now, we have good news to report. We have positive things to be said during the interactive dialogue, and maybe there won't be any need for anyone to make any more recommendations on the death penalty in 5 years' time, because it will be done and dusted by then.
And I just want to end on a positive note that 2015, 2017, Guatemala and Suriname are the two that have abolished the death penalty in the 25 countries in the Greater Caribbean. So there is some progress. I know it's not the English-speaking ones, but that's progress in our region.
And we'll be looking forward to later this year in November, the reviews of Antigua and Barbuda, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Trinidad and Tobago. So there's more work to be done with the World Coalition and GCL to raise these issues in the Universal Periodic Review and also at the other UN mechanisms to complement the great work that GCL is doing on the ground in the region. So we're really thankful for all of the hard work you and your colleagues are doing. It's really important, and the coalition stands with you, and we hope that there are ways that we can support your work and raise visibility about the important work that you're doing. So thank you so much for joining us today. And for those of you who are watching, we hope you learned something and gained some inspiration from our wonderful colleagues at Greater Caribbean for Life.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, Amy and Louis. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Delina, thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Take care. Bye.